A young husband walked into his own home and found his father having sex with his wife. In a sudden, uncontrollable rage, he killed them both that night. This is the story of John Mitchell, a 28-year-old construction foreman who thought he knew his family. But when the ultimate betrayal unfolded right in his own bedroom, 3 lives would be destroyed forever. The investigation that followed exposed years of hidden family manipulation, lies, and a web of deception so twisted that even seasoned detectives couldn't believe what they uncovered. What drove a son to murder his own father? What kind of woman sleeps with her husband's father? And how does a family secret so dark remain hidden for years until it explodes in the most violent way possible? Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This case will shock you to your core, because what the police found wasn't just a crime of passion. It was the climax of a carefully orchestrated betrayal that had been building for 3 years. Charlotte Mitchell wasn't just cheating on her husband. She was being groomed by his own father, Patrick Mitchell, a man who had been planning this affair since the day she married into the family. The courtroom revelations will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty, and the lengths people will go to satisfy their darkest desires. By the end of this story, you'll be asking yourself one terrifying question: how well do you really know the people closest to you? John Mitchell seemed like the all-American success story. Born and raised in Springfield, Ohio, he was the kind of man who worked with his hands and believed in honest labor. At 28 years old, John supervised construction crews for Henderson Associates, one of the region's most respected building companies. His colleagues describe him as reliable, hard-working, and surprisingly gentle for a man who spent his days around heavy machinery and rough crews. John had calloused hands, but a soft heart, especially when it came to his wife, Charlotte. Charlotte Reynolds was everything John thought he wanted in a woman. 25 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to light up every room she entered. She worked as a receptionist at a local dental office, but her real talent was making people feel comfortable. She had that rare gift of remembering everyone's name, their children's birthdays, and exactly how they liked their coffee. When she and John met at a friend's barbecue in the summer of 2019, it felt like destiny. She laughed at his jokes, didn't mind that he worked long hours, and seemed genuinely interested in his stories about construction projects and weekend fishing trips. They dated for 8 months before John proposed with his grandmother's ring, a simple but elegant diamond that had been in the Mitchell family for 3 generations. Charlotte said yes without hesitation, and they married in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church in October 2020. It was everything John had dreamed of: a beautiful wife, a steady job, and the promise of building something lasting together. They moved into a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street, complete with a white picket fence and a small garden where Charlotte planted tomatoes and sunflowers. But there was one person who seemed to pay special attention to Charlotte from the very beginning: John's father, Patrick Mitchell. Patrick was 53 years old, recently divorced from John's mother after 26 years of marriage. The divorce had been bitter, with accusations of emotional manipulation and financial control that left the family fractured. Patrick was a successful insurance salesman who drove a black BMW and wore expensive suits that made him look younger than his years. He had salt and pepper hair, piercing blue eyes, and the kind of confident smile that had made him successful in sales, and apparently with women. From the moment John introduced Charlotte to his father, Patrick made it clear that he approved of his son's choice. Maybe a little too clear. He complimented Charlotte's appearance every time he saw her, remembered details about her work that even John sometimes forgot, and always found reasons to stop by their house when he knew John would be working late. At first, Charlotte mentioned these visits to John, describing them as sweet gestures from a father-in-law who was trying to stay connected to his son's new family. John's childhood with Patrick had been complicated. His father was the kind of man who demanded respect but rarely showed affection. Patrick had high expectations for everyone around him, especially his son, and he had a way of making John feel like nothing he did was ever quite good enough. Even as an adult, John found himself seeking his father's approval, hoping that maybe this time Patrick would say he was proud. When Patrick seemed to genuinely like Charlotte and went out of his way to make her feel welcome in the family, John was actually relieved. Finally, he thought, his father approved of something he had done. The house on Maple Street became John and Charlotte's sanctuary. It was a 1960s ranch-style home with hardwood floors, a brick fireplace, and large windows that filled the living room with natural light. Charlotte decorated it with warm colors and comfortable furniture, creating the kind of home where people wanted to spend time. The kitchen became her domain, where she experimented with new recipes and packed John's lunch every morning before he left for work. The master bedroom was at the back of the house, private and quiet, with a view of their small backyard where John had built a deck the previous summer. Springfield, Ohio, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where people still waved to their neighbors and left their doors unlocked. It was a place where a young couple could build a life together, raise children, and grow old surrounded by friends and family. John and Charlotte seemed to fit perfectly into this community. They attended church on Sundays, hosted barbecues for their friends, and talked about starting a family once they were more settled financially. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, something was beginning to shift. Charlotte started working later at the dental office, claiming that Dr. Peterson needed her to handle more administrative duties. She bought new clothes, started wearing makeup more often, and seemed distracted during conversations with John. When he asked about her day, her answers became vague and evasive. She began receiving text messages at odd hours, messages she would quickly delete after reading. When John asked who was texting her so late, she would say it was just her sister or a friend from work. The changes were subtle at first, the kind of things that could be explained away by stress or the natural evolution of a marriage. But John began to notice that Charlotte seemed happier when he wasn't around. She would be laughing on the phone when he walked in the door, but the laughter would stop abruptly when she saw him. She started taking longer showers, spending more time getting ready even when they had no plans to go anywhere. And most troubling of all, she became less interested in the physical intimacy that had always been a cornerstone of their relationship. John told himself that every marriage goes through phases, that Charlotte was probably just adjusting to married life, and he was being paranoid. He threw himself into his work, taking on extra projects and working longer hours, partly to provide better for their future, and partly to avoid confronting the growing distance he felt in his own home. He loved Charlotte deeply, and the thought that something might be wrong between them was almost too painful to consider. So he chose to believe her explanations, to trust that whatever was happening would work itself out with time and patience. But time would reveal that John's instincts had been right all along, and the truth was far more devastating than anything he could have imagined. What John didn't know was that his father, Patrick, had been systematically grooming Charlotte from almost the moment they met. It wasn't the obvious predatory behavior you might expect. Instead, Patrick used his years of sales experience and his intimate knowledge of what his son lacked to slowly position himself as the man Charlotte deserved. He started with compliments that seemed innocent enough, telling her that John was lucky to have found such an intelligent, beautiful woman. But gradually, those compliments evolved into something more personal and intimate. Patrick would stop by the house on Wednesday afternoons when he knew John was supervising the concrete pours at the new shopping center project. These visits, which initially lasted 15 or 20 minutes, gradually extended to an hour or more. Patrick would bring coffee from Charlotte's favorite cafe downtown, claiming he had been in the neighborhood for a client meeting. He remembered how she liked her coffee: 2 sugars, extra cream, with a shot of vanilla syrup. These small gestures made Charlotte feel seen and appreciated in a way that John's practical nature sometimes missed. During these visits, Patrick proved to be an excellent listener. When Charlotte mentioned that she was frustrated with her job at the dental office, Patrick didn't just offer generic sympathy. He asked detailed questions about her workday, remembered the names of difficult patients, and offered thoughtful advice about how to handle challenging situations. When she talked about wanting to go back to school to become a dental hygienist, Patrick didn't dismiss the idea as expensive or impractical the way John sometimes did. Instead, he researched programs in the area, found information about financial aid, and even offered to help her with the application process. Patrick had a way of making Charlotte feel like she was the most fascinating person he had ever met. He asked about her childhood, her dreams, and her opinions on everything from politics to movies. He remembered details from previous conversations and followed up with thoughtful questions that showed he had been genuinely listening. In contrast, John often came home tired from long days at construction sites, more interested in dinner and television than in deep conversations about Charlotte's inner life. The emotional affair began months before it became physical. Patrick started texting Charlotte regularly, initially with innocent messages about family events or local news. But the messages gradually became more personal and frequent. He would text her good morning before John woke up, and good night after John fell asleep. He sent her articles he thought she would find interesting, photos of beautiful places he had visited for work, and eventually messages telling her how special she was and how much he looked forward to their conversations. Charlotte found herself thinking about Patrick more and more often. She looked forward to his visits and his messages in a way that both thrilled and confused her. She had never experienced this kind of focused attention from a man who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. John loved her, she knew that, but his love felt comfortable and predictable. Patrick's attention felt electric and dangerous, and increasingly irresistible. The first time Patrick touched her inappropriately was during one of his Wednesday visits in late spring of 2021. Charlotte had been showing him the vegetable garden she had planted in the backyard, explaining her plans for tomatoes and herbs. As they stood looking at the neat rows of seedlings, Patrick placed his hand on the small of her back, just above the waistband of her jeans. It was a gesture that could have been interpreted as fatherly affection, but the way his thumb moved in small circles against her shirt made his intentions clear. Charlotte should have stepped away, should have told him that his touch was inappropriate. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, closing her eyes, and feeling more desired than she had in months. The physical affair began 2 months later, on a Wednesday afternoon in July, when John was working a double shift at a commercial project across town. Patrick arrived at the house with more than just coffee. He brought lunch from Charlotte's favorite restaurant and a bottle of wine. He suggested they eat on the deck John had built, enjoying the warm summer afternoon. 1 glass of wine became 2, and their conversation became more intimate and personal than it had ever been before. Patrick told Charlotte that he had been thinking about her constantly, that she deserved better than a husband who took her for granted, and that he couldn't stop imagining what it would be like to truly appreciate everything she had to offer. When Patrick kissed her that afternoon, Charlotte's resistance crumbled completely. The kiss was everything that her physical relationship with John was not: passionate, urgent, and filled with a desperate desire that made her feel beautiful and wanted. They made love on the couch in the living room, in the same space where she and John watched television every evening. The betrayal was complete and devastating, but in that moment, Charlotte felt more alive than she had in years. The affair continued throughout the summer and into the fall of 2021. Patrick would visit every Wednesday, and occasionally on other afternoons when he could create business excuses for being in the neighborhood. They developed an elaborate system of communication, using a messaging app that automatically deleted their conversations. Patrick bought Charlotte gifts: expensive lingerie that she hid in the back of her closet, jewelry that she wore only when John was at work, and books of poetry that fed the romantic fantasy she had created around their relationship. Charlotte told herself that what she was doing wasn't really hurting anyone. John seemed content with his work and his predictable life, and she wasn't taking anything away from him that he had been paying attention to in the first place. She convinced herself that Patrick understood her in ways that John never could, and that their connection was deeper and more meaningful than the simple marriage she had settled for. She began to fantasize about a life with Patrick, imagining that he would leave his current girlfriend and that somehow they could be together openly. But Patrick had no intentions of leaving anyone or changing his comfortable life. For him, Charlotte was an exciting diversion, a way to exercise power over his son while enjoying the company of a beautiful young woman who made him feel virile and desirable. He told Charlotte what she wanted to hear, made promises he had no intention of keeping, and used her emotional vulnerability to maintain a sexual relationship that fed his ego while requiring no real commitment or sacrifice on his part. As 2021 turned into 2022, the affair became more brazen and careless. Patrick started calling Charlotte during evening hours when John was home, claiming to need information about family events or John's work schedule. He would engage John in conversation while making eye contact with Charlotte across the room, a power play that both excited and terrified her. He began staying for dinner occasionally, sitting at John's table, eating Charlotte's cooking, and engaging in casual conversation about John's work and their marriage, all while maintaining an intimate relationship with his son's wife. The psychological manipulation was constant and insidious. Patrick convinced Charlotte that John didn't really appreciate her, pointing out all the ways that his son failed to meet her needs or recognize her worth. He told her that John was too simple and unambitious to truly understand a woman of her intelligence and beauty. He made her feel like she was wasting her life in a marriage that was beneath her potential, while positioning himself as the sophisticated, experienced man who could give her the life she deserved. By early 2022, Charlotte was living in a constant state of anxiety and excitement. She felt guilty about betraying John, but she also felt more desired and alive than ever before. The secrecy of the affair added an element of danger that made every encounter with Patrick feel intense and meaningful. She began to resent John for his simple contentment, for his lack of curiosity about her inner life, and for his inability to provide the sophisticated romance that Patrick offered. She started arguments with John over trivial matters, partly out of guilt and partly to justify her continued infidelity in her own mind. The affair had been going on for over a year when John began to notice more significant changes in Charlotte's behavior and appearance. She had started working out regularly, claiming she wanted to be healthier, but the result was a more confident, sensual version of herself that seemed designed to attract attention. She bought new clothes with money she claimed came from overtime at the dental office, but her pay stubs didn't reflect any additional hours. She became secretive about her phone, taking it with her to the bathroom and sleeping with it under her pillow instead of charging it on the nightstand as she always had before. Most troubling of all, Charlotte became increasingly critical of John and their life together. She complained that he was boring, that he never wanted to do anything adventurous, and that he was holding her back from her potential. She suggested that maybe they had married too young, that they wanted different things from life, and that maybe they should consider counseling to work through their problems. John, who was still deeply in love with his wife and committed to their marriage, agreed to try counseling, hoping that whatever was wrong between them could be fixed with professional help and honest communication. What John didn't realize was that Charlotte's suggestions about counseling and their marital problems were coming directly from Patrick, who was encouraging her to create distance in her marriage so that their affair could continue without interference. Patrick had convinced Charlotte that John was the problem, that their marriage was fundamentally flawed, and that she deserved better than the simple life he could provide. The counseling sessions became another tool of manipulation, as Charlotte used them to voice complaints that Patrick had planted in her mind, while John struggled to understand what had gone wrong in what he thought had been a happy marriage. The affair might have continued indefinitely if Patrick hadn't become careless and overconfident. He began taking greater risks, staying at the house longer, and becoming more obvious about his interest in Charlotte even when John was present. He started touching Charlotte inappropriately at family gatherings, standing too close to her at barbecues, and making comments about her appearance that crossed the line from fatherly approval to sexual interest. The thrill of the secret relationship had begun to fade for Patrick, and he was seeking new ways to exercise his power and control over the situation. It was this overconfidence and carelessness that would ultimately lead to the discovery that destroyed 3 lives and shattered a family forever. Tuesday, March 15th, 2022, started like any other day for John Mitchell. He woke up at 5:30 a.m., took a quick shower while Charlotte slept, and grabbed the lunch she had packed for him the night before. The Henderson Associates crew was working on the foundation for a new medical complex across town, and John expected to be there until at least 6 o'clock that evening. He kissed Charlotte goodbye, whispered that he loved her, and headed out into the cool March morning, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. The medical complex project had been plagued with problems from the beginning. The city inspector had rejected their initial foundation plan, forcing the crew to start over with new specifications. The concrete supplier had delivered the wrong mixture twice, causing delays that put them weeks behind schedule. John prided himself on running efficient projects, and these setbacks were causing him constant stress and frustration. He had been working 12-hour days for 2 weeks straight, trying to make up for lost time and keep the project on budget. That Tuesday morning brought another crisis. The city inspector arrived at 7 a.m. and immediately identified problems with the rebar placement that would require significant corrections before they could proceed. John spent the morning coordinating with his crew to fix the issues, calling suppliers to rush order additional materials, and dealing with an increasingly frustrated client who was demanding explanations for the continued delays. By noon, John had developed a splitting headache and realized he had forgotten to eat breakfast in his rush to address the morning's problems. It was Charlotte who had suggested he come home for lunch when he called to vent his frustrations. She sounded sympathetic and caring, telling him that she had made his favorite sandwich and that a quick break might help him feel better before tackling the afternoon's challenges. John was touched by her thoughtfulness, especially given how distant and critical she had been in recent months. Maybe the marriage counseling they had started was actually helping. Maybe Charlotte was making an effort to be more supportive of his work stress. The thought of going home to his wife, eating a good meal, and taking a short break from the chaos of the construction site seemed like exactly what he needed. John told his crew he would be back in an hour and drove the 20 minutes home to Maple Street. As he turned onto his street, he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Their neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, with mature trees lining the sidewalks and well-maintained lawns that spoke to the pride their neighbors took in their community. Home represented everything good in John's life: his marriage, his stability, and his hopes for the future. In less than an hour, all of that would be destroyed forever. As John pulled into his driveway, he noticed his father's black BMW parked at the curb in front of their house. This wasn't entirely unusual. Patrick had been stopping by regularly for months, and Charlotte had mentioned that he sometimes visited during the day when John was at work. John felt a brief moment of irritation that his father was there during his lunch break, cutting into the private time he had been looking forward to spending with Charlotte. But he quickly dismissed the feeling as selfish. Patrick was probably just being social, and Charlotte seemed to enjoy his company. John could eat his lunch and visit with his father at the same time. John walked up the front steps and inserted his key into the lock, but the door was already unlocked. Charlotte usually kept the doors locked during the day, especially when she was home alone, but maybe she had unlocked it when she saw Patrick arriving. John opened the front door and stepped into the living room, calling out to let them know he was home. "Charlotte, Dad, I'm home for lunch." The house was quiet, but he could hear muffled sounds coming from the back of the house, from the direction of their bedroom. For a moment, John stood still in the living room, trying to process what he was hearing. The sounds were rhythmic and urgent, and there was something about them that made his stomach tighten with a dread he couldn't quite name. He called out again, louder this time. "Charlotte, is everything okay?" The sounds continued, and John began walking toward the bedroom, his work boots heavy on the hardwood floor. With each step, the sounds became clearer and more unmistakable. By the time he reached the hallway leading to their bedroom, John knew exactly what he was hearing, but his mind refused to accept it. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, John could see movement on his bed. The bed where he and Charlotte slept every night. The bed where they had made love as recently as the previous weekend. His hand was shaking as he pushed the door open wider, and what he saw in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. His father, Patrick Mitchell, was having sex with his wife, Charlotte. They were so consumed with their passion that they didn't immediately notice John standing in the doorway, frozen in shock and disbelief. The scene was more devastating than anything John could have imagined. This wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment or a single mistake. The way they moved together, the familiarity of their touches, the intimate whispers he could hear. All of it spoke to an ongoing relationship that had been hidden from him for months. They were comfortable with each other's bodies, practiced in their movements, and completely lost in a passion that excluded John entirely from their world. The betrayal was complete and devastating, involving the two people he loved most in the world. When Charlotte finally opened her eyes and saw John standing in the doorway, her face went white with terror. She pushed Patrick off of her and grabbed for the sheet, trying to cover herself, but it was far too late. Patrick turned to see what had startled Charlotte, and when he saw his son standing there, his expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like satisfaction. For a brief moment, all three of them were frozen in this tableau of betrayal and discovery, none of them able to speak or move. The silence lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then John heard a sound coming from his own throat, a low, animal moan of pain that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly Charlotte was scrambling to get off the bed, wrapping the sheet around herself, and trying to find words that could somehow explain or minimize what John had just witnessed. "John, please, let me explain. This isn't what it looks like." But John wasn't listening to Charlotte's desperate attempts at explanation. His entire world had just collapsed, and all he could focus on was the sight of his father calmly getting dressed, showing no shame or remorse for what he had done. Patrick was actually smiling slightly, as if he was pleased to have been caught, as if this moment of discovery was somehow satisfying to him. That smile, more than anything else, ignited a rage in John that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. "How long?" John's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a dangerous edge that made Charlotte take a step backward. "How long has this been going on?" Neither Patrick nor Charlotte answered immediately, and their silence only fueled John's growing fury. "How long?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the bedroom walls. "John, please calm down," Patrick said, his voice steady and condescending. "You're overreacting. These things happen in families. Charlotte and I have developed feelings for each other and—" John didn't let his father finish the sentence. The casual, dismissive tone, the suggestion that this betrayal was somehow normal or acceptable, sent John over an edge he didn't even know existed. The rage that had been building inside him exploded into action, and before he fully realized what he was doing, John lunged toward his father with a violence that surprised even him. Patrick, still partially undressed and caught off guard, stumbled backward and fell against the dresser. The bronze lamp on Charlotte's side of the bed, the same lamp she used to read romance novels late at night, became John's weapon. He grabbed it without thinking, his mind completely consumed by the need to hurt the man who had destroyed his life. The first blow caught Patrick across the side of the head, and the older man dropped to his knees, blood immediately streaming from a gash above his ear. Charlotte screamed, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. John was operating on pure instinct now, all rational thought replaced by a primal need for revenge. Patrick tried to defend himself, raising his hands to block John's attacks, but he was no match for his son's strength and fury. John struck him again and again, each blow fueled by months of accumulated betrayal and humiliation. This was the man who had raised him, who had taught him right from wrong, who had earned his respect and loyalty, and he had used all of that to seduce and steal the woman John loved most in the world. The hypocrisy and cruelty of it was more than John could bear. Charlotte was still screaming, begging John to stop, trying to pull him away from Patrick. But when she grabbed John's arm, trying to protect his father from further violence, something snapped completely inside John's mind. She was still defending Patrick, even now, even after being caught in the act of betraying her marriage vows. The realization that Charlotte was more concerned about Patrick's welfare than about what she had done to their marriage sent John into an even deeper rage. Without fully realizing what he was doing, John turned on Charlotte. The same lamp that had just killed his father became the weapon he used against his wife. Charlotte had time for one terrified scream before the bronze base connected with her skull, and then she fell beside Patrick, blood pooling beneath her auburn hair on their bedroom carpet. In less than 5 minutes, John had destroyed the two people who had betrayed him most completely. And in doing so, he had destroyed himself as well. The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. John stood in his own bedroom, surrounded by the bodies of his father and his wife, the bronze lamp still in his hand, trying to process what he had just done. The rage that had consumed him was gone, replaced by a hollow shock that left him feeling empty and disconnected from reality. This couldn't be real. This couldn't have happened. But the blood on the lamp, the bodies on the floor, and the complete destruction of his life were undeniably real. John set the lamp back on the nightstand with trembling hands and walked out of the bedroom, leaving behind the scene of ultimate betrayal and ultimate revenge. He went to the kitchen, sat down at the table where Charlotte had served him breakfast that very morning, and called 911 to report what he had done. The 911 call that John Mitchell made at 12:47 p.m. on March 15, 2022, would become a crucial piece of evidence in his trial. His voice was eerily calm as he spoke to the dispatcher, a stark contrast to the violence that had just occurred in his bedroom. "I need to report a double homicide," he said simply. "I just killed my wife and my father. They were having an affair, and I caught them together. I'm at 1247 Maple Street. I'll be waiting on the front porch for the police to arrive." The dispatcher, trained to handle emergency situations, tried to keep John on the line while police and paramedics were dispatched to the scene. She asked if anyone was injured and needed medical attention, if the victims were definitely deceased, and if John was injured or in need of medical care. John answered each question with the same eerie calm, providing clear, factual responses that revealed nothing of the emotional devastation he was experiencing. When she asked if he had any weapons, John told her that he had used a lamp and that it was still in the bedroom with the bodies. Detective Sarah Martinez was the first investigator to arrive at the Maple Street house, just minutes behind the initial responding officers. A 15-year veteran of the Springfield Police Department, Detective Martinez had worked hundreds of domestic violence cases, but she had never encountered a scene quite like this one. John Mitchell was exactly where he said he would be, sitting calmly on his front porch steps, his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. There was blood on his clothes and hands, but he made no attempt to clean himself up or hide the evidence of what he had done. When Detective Martinez approached John to place him under arrest, he offered no resistance. He stood up when instructed, placed his hands behind his back for the handcuffs, and walked quietly to the patrol car. His only words were a request to call his supervisor at Henderson Associates to let them know he wouldn't be back to work that afternoon. Even in the immediate aftermath of committing double homicide, John was concerned about his professional responsibilities, a detail that would later be used by both the prosecution and defense to illustrate different aspects of his character. Inside the house, the crime scene told a story of passion, betrayal, and explosive violence. The bedroom where John and Charlotte had shared 3 years of married life had become a scene of devastating carnage. Patrick Mitchell, age 53, was found partially dressed beside the bed, having suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries to his head and upper body. Charlotte Mitchell, age 25, was found near the dresser, also having died from blunt force trauma. The bronze lamp that had served as the murder weapon was placed neatly back on the nightstand, as if John had tried to restore some semblance of order to the chaos he had created. What struck Detective Martinez most forcefully about the scene was how it had been preserved after the murders. John had made no attempt to clean up the blood, hide the bodies, or alter the scene in any way. The bed was still unmade from Patrick and Charlotte's encounter, Charlotte's clothes were still scattered on the floor, and Patrick's expensive suit was draped over the chair where he had apparently placed it before getting into bed with his daughter-in-law. It was as if John wanted the evidence of their affair to be clearly visible, as if he needed the world to understand exactly what he had discovered and why he had reacted with such violence. The investigation into the murders began immediately, but it quickly became clear that this was not a case that would require extensive detective work to solve. John had confessed immediately, the murder weapon was obvious, and there were no questions about what had happened or who was responsible. The real question was why. What had driven John Mitchell to commit such a violent act, and what had been the nature of the relationship between Patrick Mitchell and Charlotte Mitchell? The first breakthrough in understanding the affair came from Charlotte's cell phone, which was found on the bedroom dresser. Detective Martinez obtained a warrant to search the phone's contents, and what she found painted a picture of deception and manipulation that extended far beyond a simple extramarital affair. The phone contained hundreds of text messages between Charlotte and Patrick, dating back almost 2 years. The messages started innocently enough, casual conversations about family events and friendly check-ins, but they quickly evolved into something much more intimate and inappropriate. The text messages revealed that Patrick had been systematically grooming Charlotte from very early in her marriage to John. He used classic manipulation techniques, isolating her from her husband emotionally, convincing her that John didn't appreciate or understand her, and positioning himself as the sophisticated, caring man who could give her the life she deserved. The messages showed Patrick encouraging Charlotte to keep secrets from John, to become more critical of her marriage, and to gradually distance herself from her husband both emotionally and physically. What was most disturbing about the text messages was how calculated Patrick's approach had been. This wasn't a spontaneous attraction that had gotten out of hand. It was a deliberate seduction that had been planned and executed with the precision of a sales campaign. Patrick had studied Charlotte's insecurities and needs, then methodically exploited them to create the affair that would ultimately destroy his son's marriage and his own life. The messages also revealed that Charlotte had been genuinely conflicted about the affair, at least in the beginning. She expressed guilt about betraying John, concern about what would happen if they were discovered, and confusion about her feelings for Patrick. But Patrick consistently manipulated these concerns, convincing her that her guilt was misplaced, that John was the real problem in her life, and that their relationship was meaningful and justified. Over time, Charlotte's resistance had been worn down completely, and her messages became as passionate and committed to the affair as Patrick's. Detective Martinez also discovered that Patrick had been financially supporting the affair in ways that John had never suspected. Credit card records showed that Patrick had been paying for Charlotte's new clothes, expensive dinners when John was working late, and even a weekend getaway to a luxury hotel in Columbus that Charlotte had claimed was a girls' trip with friends from work. The financial evidence painted a picture of a man who was willing to spend considerable money to maintain his hold over his son's wife, treating her like a mistress while she remained married to John. The investigation expanded to include interviews with friends, family members, and co-workers who might have noticed signs of the affair. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had been living a double life with increasing skill and confidence. Charlotte's co-workers at the dental office reported that she had seemed happier and more confident in recent months, but they attributed this to her marriage counseling with John, rather than to an extramarital affair. Her sister, who lived in Cleveland, said that Charlotte had seemed distracted during their phone conversations, but had never mentioned any problems in her marriage or any involvement with John's father. John's co-workers painted a picture of a man who had been under increasing stress in recent months, both from work pressures and from problems at home. His supervisor at Henderson Associates, Mike Torres, reported that John had been working longer hours and seemed less focused than usual. Several crew members mentioned that John had seemed worried about his marriage, but he had never discussed specific problems or mentioned any concerns about his father's relationship with Charlotte. The most revealing interviews were with Patrick's ex-wife, Margaret Mitchell, and with his current girlfriend, Lisa Henderson. Margaret, who had divorced Patrick 2 years earlier, described him as a manipulative man who used emotional control to get what he wanted from women.